Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us today. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest today, David Feeney, who's from Cushman and Wakefield, which is really respected in the state industry and in particular student accommodation. David plays a significant role within their team, particularly in producing their annual student accommodation report, which we're going to talk to you about today. When it comes to Cushman and Wakefield student accommodation report, it's important to acknowledge that it's a collaborative effort by their team. It's a report that we eagerly look forward to each year because it's a treasure trove of insights into the student accommodation sector. It guides us, gives us the lowdown on supply and demand dynamics and rental trends in various cities, which is obviously very interesting to us. Over the past year, our industry has experienced some interesting twists and turns, let's say. High student demand in many cities has been impacting housing markets and driving up rents. At the same time, the international student market has brought on some unpredictability, with a surge in bookings followed by a surprising number of no-shows at the start of the academic year. Today, we're fortunate to have David here with us to share his insights on these industry trends. Let's dive into the discussion and gain a better understanding of the current landscape and what's on the horizon. Welcome, David. We appreciate the contributions that Cushman and Wakefield brings to our industry knowledge. Thanks. Over to you.
Afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to start by being through some of the big picture numbers on demand. We've been doing this for a number of years now. I thought it was kind of interesting to look back on how much the market has changed since changes to the tuition fee system in 2012. And I think some of these headlines here are really important in setting the scene in terms of the market division themes that I'll talk about over the next 15, 20 minutes or so. Firstly, 2.2 million full-time students in the system, and we're seeing a real concentration of students into key locations across the UK. So 11 locations have grown student numbers by over 10,000 since 2012-13. Of massive importance to demand for PBSA in particular is the fact that 7 locations are now home to 15,000 national students. Many more are home to several thousand international students, but the patterns of demand from these students are changing dramatically, especially over the last 3 years. And the final headline really is the flight to quality theme that we talked about in the annual report for years, and this is absolutely entrenched in the sector. So since 2012, there were nearly 114,000 undergraduates studying at Russell Group institutions, but only 32,000 were at post-1992 universities, and many of these new unis are still growing because of massive recruitment at postgrad level. I think it's really important to say it's not necessarily translating through to demand for PBSA, and policy changes are really going to impact this area of the market. In terms of new beds for the academic year that just started, well, the key story is the lack of new deliveries that are being brought to the market. So just over 12,000 new beds this year, and that is almost a third of the rate we were seeing between 2016 and 2019. And when we take into account beds that left the market over the same period, the net increase is fewer than 9,000 beds. So we've got a situation where in an already structurally undersupplied market, the rate of new bed deliveries is about 13% of the annual growth in the demand pool for accommodation. So we've got a big problem. And I think this leads us nicely on to the dynamics of demand and supply. I mean, the full details are in the report or in the call, but I've got some more of the kind of big picture figures here. So around 1.5 million students need a bed during their course of study, and 50% of this figure is now located in just 12 locations. And across 70 towns and cities in the UK, 300,000 more students need a bed than was the case in 2012-13. But over the same period, the net change in PBSA beds available is just under 200,000. So we've got a situation where the national students bed ratio stands at just under 2.1 to 1. And over 100,000 more students can't access a PBSA bed than was the case in 2013. Moving on to some select markets and how their students' bed ratios have changed over time, the key message from Cushman and Wakefield is always know your markets. On the one hand here, we've got a market like Sheffield, where massive development has overtaken relatively stunted demand pool growth. And this means that headroom in the market has fallen by about 7,500 students since 2013. And then you've got a market such as Canterbury, where the market's certainly been impacted by falling student numbers and falling demand. And headroom in that market's down by almost 5,000 students. On the other hand, we've got markets such as Bristol, and I'll talk about Bristol more later, and London, where market headroom's up by over 32,000 students. And I mean, this is obviously the UK's largest market, and only 330 whole living beds were delivered to the market. And the demand pool for accommodation in London is growing by 18,000 students a year. So a big issue in the capital. In terms of demographic change, well, it's absolutely impacting demand in every single market in the UK. And I think there's three key metrics to take into account here. So that's level of study, the nation of student, and the age of the student. And I mentioned the entrenchment of the flight to quality in the sector, and this is shown by the fact that Russell Green University's attracted 54,000 more undergraduates since 2017-18. And then when we look at post-1992 former polytechnic universities, that increases only 630 students. In terms of internationals, Chinese students absolutely laser focused on going to the best institutions, and they account for over 4 in 10 internationals across the Russell Group, up fewer than 1 in 10 students at post-1992 universities. Overall, there's 3 big international cohorts at the moment. That's Chinese, Indian, and Nigerian students. They account for over half of, they account for half of all internationals in the UK. But the demand profiles across these 3 nations and their requirements are very, very different. And over 3/4 of Chinese students are aged under 23, and over half of Indians and Nigerians are aged over 25. It's crucial to mention that recruitment from India and Nigeria has the potential to be impacted in January of 2024 when visa rules change on dependents. And there are potential storm clouds on the horizon in relation to China. So undergraduate acceptances from Chinese students are down 9% this year. Potentially, this has impacted some higher end providers already. I think it remains to be seen whether this is the start of a slowdown or maybe a Chinese zero COVID hangover, and then the impact of Australia following reopening. It's really interesting to look at this in location terms. So this shows one UK city, and this is growth over the last 2 years alone. So one area of the city has seen Chinese students grow by over 5,000 in 2 years, a very small increase in Indian and Nigerian students. The other part of the city has actually seen Chinese students fall, and then a fairly significant growth in Indian and Nigerian students. And certainly this is very interesting in terms of the type of accommodation that needs to be provided, because in Area B, we are seeing a lot of applications for high-end studio rooms, and they simply aren't the type of accommodation that Indian and Nigerian students are generally going to live in. Moving on to rental growth, well, in terms of 23-24, I think signs at top is unprecedented, and I think it's again interesting to view this in terms of market division, with locations furthest and also moving fastest away from market equilibrium, seeing the most significant levels of growth. Glasgow is probably the most high profile and best example of this. So headroom in the market has grown by 54% in just 2 years. And this is resulting in private sector rental growth of almost 20%. I guess up the road in St Andrews, again, very strong performance. Manchester as well, alongside Bristol. I think rental growth performance in Bristol would probably have been even stronger, but a lack of development means the market's now home to fewer than 1,000 direct ground suites due to the scale of the supply in the market. And then in contrast, Coventry has seen very muted rental growth due to a massive fall in headroom as a result of falling demand and a huge number of new deliveries, as well as Colchester, where new on-campus developments in a town of still on student numbers. Quickly on dynamic pricing, I think this graphic shows movement in direct rents through the cycle on a quarterly basis, and we certainly saw significant pushing rents of Q3 of 2023. I think it's important to note that dynamic pricing is still limited to around 10% of the overall market and is largely restricted to premium products. I think it was used in the strongest markets this year, and those certainly in a phase of recovery where perhaps operators thought the market performed better than they were originally anticipating. I think it's important to say prices go down as well as up, and we did see a number of prices reduce throughout the year. But despite the strength of demand and everything we know about rental growth, there were a decent number of unfilled beds across the sector, and I think it's important to say that this market is not a bet at any price, and some providers may simply have pushed too far. And sadly, what we saw from some universities that absolutely not expecting it is unfilled university beds. I think what we've seen this year is the first phase of the affordability crunch, and those students that are on the borderline of being able to commute to university or live in PBSA perhaps made the decision this year to commute because the cost of some accommodation was simply too high for them. And that moves us quite nicely onto affordability. So only a 2.8% increase in the loan against the 10.4% increase in direct rents this year. So something eventually has to give. And the parental earnings threshold, at which you can receive the maximum maintenance loans, has stayed at £25,000 for a number of years now. And if it had grown at the rate of inflation, now stand at £36,500. And we've got a real issue in the sector where viability of building new en suites is a minimum of £170 a week. So there's no easy solution, no forthcoming solution to the affordability crunch. And I thought it was interesting to look at new deliveries over time. So in 2013, the average price of all beds was about £108 a week, and new beds were being delivered at about 2.6% above that. The average price in 23-24 is about £168 a week. New beds being delivered at an average of £205 a week, so 22% higher. I think it's really interesting to look at the huge differences in student support across UK nations and what this means for affordability. And what we would class as affordable, England is home to the fewest number of affordable beds, about 22% of beds overall. And, you know, in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and in the other devolved nations, the loan and bursary awards are far more generous than England, so accommodation is effectively more affordable. I mean, you may start to see this come through in terms of application numbers to some institutions in the future. I mean, we always say the only way to deliver more affordable accommodations is to deliver more beds to the market. And I think this chart is quite interesting. So it shows that a lack of supply results in huge differentials between the average university bed in terms of price and the private sector bed. So the pricing differential is in Bristol is 1,000 times higher than the peer group average between a private sector bed where there simply aren't a lot available anymore and an average university rents. A little bit on product quality. So this continues to rise across the board, and much of this is being driven by amenity spaces. So the average amount of space being provided per student in new deliveries is 50% higher than was the case in 2018. We think these spaces are great. They encourage interaction and student experience, and certainly tells in terms of the medium-term rental performance of assets. However, I think with affordability concerns massively on the rise is the potential that someone will start to deliver products with less amenity space to try and drive lower rents. And in terms of the policy environment, I already mentioned briefly, the key change on the horizon is the January 2024 change on students bringing dependents into the UK, unless they're on a research-focused course of study. The vast majority of those bring dependents with them are from India and Nigeria, and this is going to present post-1992 universities in particular have been an issue, as they've relied on this cohort to bolster student numbers over recent years. So the chart on the left shows Indian and Nigerian students as a percentage of all postgrads at some universities. And as you can see, they account for upwards of 70% of the postgrad institutions. Then on the right, you can see postgrads as a percentage of all students at some universities. Now, these are obviously not your traditional research-centered universities. These are post-1992s that have gone from, in some cases, a 6 to 7% postgraduate population to upwards of a third or more of all students studying at postgrad level in less than 5 years. So if there is a significant hit because of this visa change, then you've got a massive hit to the balance sheet of some universities. In terms of other potential policy impacts on the sector, I think there's been much talk in government on core value degrees, and to quote ministers, they want to break the unquestionable belief between going to university and social mobility. And the government has asked the Office for Students to report on how poor value degrees and poor outcomes at university could be measured. And in reality, we think this is very, very difficult. So one measure being looked at the moment is poor continuation rates, but only 2 universities across the whole country fail the Office for Students test on this measure. Other measures being considered, such as a percentage of students earning a certain amount post-graduation. This would massively penalise a lot of arts-focused institutions, so this seems like a bit of a political non-starter at the moment. And I think it's really interesting that the government pushes degree apprenticeships as an alternative to going to university, but in reality, there's not a lot of course provision compared to proper higher education, and companies such as Dyson have recently pulled out, saying they lack academic vigour. Then finally from us, this is just a couple of extracts from our model on which are the best markets to be in or to invest in. It covers a massive range of historic, current, and forward-looking metrics, and we've got the no-brainer markets that probably everyone on the webinar knows about: Edinburgh, Bristol, Durham, Bath, Greenock, Ian. But I think the interesting ones are these markets that are in a strong phase of recovery, so Newcastle, Cardiff, Southampton, and certainly what we've seen in terms of rental growth for the past 2 years in these markets as they've recovered, then rents are almost at the kind of level where they're now viable to build in again. So I think they're really interesting propositions over the next, 2, 3, 5 years. And then, obviously down the bottom, we've got some very, very difficult secondary and tertiary markets that are performing quite poorly at the moment. And that's everything from me into the presentation.
Thank you very much, David. Just a few questions that came in while you were going through that. Firstly, can you just run us through the degree value again, and what that's about, and why that might be important?
I think the government's under significant pressure to come up with some way of measuring what good outcomes are post-graduation, and it finds it very, very difficult to do that at the moment. And effectively, at the moment, there's no definitive measure as to what that is. So they're looking at a number of proxies, and the OFS has already got a set of rules in place in which you can intervene at poor performing universities. Well, like I say, the continuation rates at nearly every institution are very, very, very high, and it seems very unfair to penalise universities where a certain proportion of graduates perhaps don't earn a certain amount after graduation and class those as poor value if there's social value attached to those kind of degrees. So I think the government really is finding it very, very difficult to come up with any kind of definition or policy tool as to what poor value degree is. And, my personal view is that they're just looking for a kind of softly approach where they'll say, well, students, think about your future, you're perhaps getting into potentially a large amount of debt. Make sure you're making the right decision and make sure that you're using all the tools available to you. I mean, the government's recently released a new tool online where you can you can check degrees, etc. And it's just saying to students, make sure you're making the right decision about your future.
Thanks, David. One of the delegates has asked you to explain headroom, what headroom means, and I know I've asked you in the past, so it's if you could sort of talk us through what that is and why it's important in a particular city, that would be great.
Yeah, so and Cushman, you used to talk in terms of student bed ratios, and I guess that still remains our gold standard blunt instrument for measuring the health of the market. But I think headroom, which is the difference between the number of beds available and the number of students that need a bed, is a really interesting metric to look at over the last couple of years, because we've seen such a staggering growth in student numbers in markets like Glasgow that you can see the headroom figure increase by 50% in 2 years. So yeah, I just think those markets where you do get that dramatic headroom increase in such a period of time, that does allow providers to increase rents at those staggering levels that we see in some markets where all private sector beds increase by almost 20%, and then purely direct beds that don't have any sort of university relationship or tie, we've seen some of those increase by 30% or more.
So thank you for that. The other thing that I just wanted to pick up on is just in terms of numbers, I suppose. So you sort of talk about 1.5 million students needing a bed. It's 700,000 kind of from PBSA, so either Purpose Built or university. So the rest really is coming from HMO, which is a good 250,000 bed spaces. What's in your view is the potential impact and challenges around renters reform on that and the market, given that we are getting increasing numbers of students? It doesn't look like we're building a lot of new purpose built stuff or quickly enough. So any thoughts from you on that area?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we've been modelling is where the demand pool might go in the future, measuring this against potential increases in supply. I mean, I mentioned earlier that we've seen net increase in beds of 9,000 this year, and we do expect that to increase, and we expect new bed deliveries to be, 18, 22,000 a year, maybe on average to 2030. But all that modelling shows that headroom market's going to grow by over 200,000 more students by 2030. And, you guys are the experts in the private rented sector, and you guys know that we're seeing increased redemptions from those private landlords because they are finding it so difficult at the moment. They're being hit in policy terms, they're being hit financially. So we've got a big issue when not enough PBSA beds are being delivered, and then the traditional alternative, there are few of those beds available as well.
Someone's asked, could you make some observations about the Birmingham market? And I don't want to put you on the spot sort of specifically. So is there anything you can offer in terms of what you see happening in Birmingham?
Birmingham has always operated as two different markets. So you've got the city centre, Aston, BC cluster, which is very well supplied with, a lot of first, second, third and fourth generation beds. And the student bed ratio there is effectively very, very low. And, that area remains the focus of most of the pipeline in Birmingham. And then you've got the cellular University of Birmingham cluster, which behaves very well differently. The student bed ratio in that area of the city is under 2.5. We think it needs more beds. So, I guess it's a tale of two markets, that one. And I think it shows in terms of what's happened in terms of the longer term rental growth in markets such as Birmingham compared to Bristol, Manchester, etc. Rental growth has been far lower because supply has been so high, and that city centre cluster of accommodations is really, really high.
Thank you for that, David. And in terms of, so we talked about this briefly before the webinar started. I thought the stuff in the report about a bed, but not at any price was interesting, because we are seeing a lot of sort of price increases across the board, both PBSA and HMO. So can you talk to me a little bit about what you kind of see in terms of the future there, and what some of the trends might result from that kind of sort of significant upward pressure on rents?
Yeah, I think one of the things we're wrestling with internally is every time historically in the last 20 years when there was a fee increase, we always thought, well, will this result in an increase in commuting students? And it never has. Probably because, that student loan debt only has to be paid once you're in a certain amount. It's something very abstract in the future for the students that just want to get a good degree and make themselves employable. I think what we're seeing this year, and I think I mentioned it, is we are seeing an increase in those kind of borderline commuter students choosing to stay at home. So I think that is a trend that we might very well see in the future. I think one thing we would reiterate is the only way we've seen more affordable stock being delivered across the UK is to increase supply, and it's a basic demand supply equation. If you increase supply, then you increase competition, and people are forced to be more competitive. And one of the things that we've been talking about internally over last week is what is the solution other than that? And I think depending on who's in government, it might very well and being some sort of a rent cap if we don't see some sort of a solution, and that's obviously not working very well in Ireland at the moment. So I think the only solution really, and I remember seeing 10 years ago in meetings with architects and new entrants to the market saying, let's crack this affordable product, let's take the ensuite out of the room. And no one has really done it at scale yet. And, if it was possible, it would have been done now. And build costs, well, at best, they're plateauing at the moment. So it's not becoming any easier to kind of deliver on affordable products. And it will only be delivered by increasing supply at the end of the day.
Thank you, David. Just as questions coming in, someone's also asked you a few observations about Leicester. So Leicester is quite an interesting city. But I think the context of this, I suspect it's a landlord that's asked the question in terms of, what's happened there in terms of growth of PBSA and that kind of supply-demand dynamic and how that's impacted that market.
Yeah, I think, Leicester's obviously an interesting one because I think you could consider it a microcosm of the impacts of COVID on the market. So a lower-ranked university like De Montfort that would ordinarily have taken a large number of students through clearing, have got, its proportion of applicants. Effectively, the teacher-assessed grade system allowed those students to trade up to, quote-unquote, better universities. So that kind of leaves those institutions with a hole. And, we've gone back to year 16 now, but that takes a few years to feed back through the market. So your second and third year reduced numbers of undergraduates obviously impacts on the total student population. And, historically, Leicester has been a very, very well supplied market. So, we know the market's performed poorly. The rental growth shows that, the occupancy levels show that. So I think it's got a couple of years before it starts to recover properly.
Thank you. The other thing that I wanted to pick up on from the wider report was how the kind of makeup of certain towns had changed. So I found that really interesting. So what you sort of flag up in the report is how that influx of international students has really sort of changed the dynamic of certain towns and cities quite significantly. So can you tell us a little bit about that and so what kind of impact you think that's had?
Yeah, well, I think the best examples are these post-community universities. So they've obviously struggled at undergraduate level as this flight to quality phenomenon that we always talk about has really taken hold in the sector. There's obviously a hit to the balance sheet. What's the solution? Well, the government allows the post-study work visa system, and the UK is very, very attractive for, Indian and Nigerian students. They're coming to the UK, they can get qualified doing a 1-year master's, they can stay in the UK, for 2 years afterwards, find graduate employment. And that's allowed them to really bring in thousands and thousands more of these students than they ever would have been able to before. I mean, some of these universities have devised new courses in, computer science areas, artificial intelligence, and they can go from standing start to 2,500, 3,000 students on these courses in a single year. But we know that traditional PBSA isn't something they would ordinarily demand. they might be, over the age of 25. They'll come over to the UK with a family member. I mean, less than half a percent of PBSA across the country is geared towards families. So they'll look into the private rented sector. Those that do come, by themselves, often they'll look into live as cheaply as possible. So they'll go and live with relatives. They'll surface their way through on their postgraduate degree. So you have seen upwards of 4,500 international students in small markets that had a very small international student population back in 2018. So markedly different, quite transformational on campus in the local community.
Thank you, David. And in terms of, so this kind of feeds in, this is a question that's come in from a couple of people, and it's about sort of utilities and utilities more generally. Do you think, how much of that do you think has been a sort of driver in this upward sort of pressure on rents? Do you think it's been really significant, in terms of that kind of built inclusive offer and how important it is?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We saw providers advertising for, maybe the first time ever at scale saying all-inclusive utilities at PBSA. I mean, for us, the sector, it's a given, but they saw it as a key marketing tool. And, obviously utilities have gone through the roof, and we've seen them going from, $350 a bed to $650 a bed across some PBSA, and, they aren't coming down anytime soon. So obviously that has to translate through into the rents they're being charged to students.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that it's worth reflecting on that, I think from a landlord perspective as well. So for the landlords that have joined us, I think a lot of PBSAs did focus on that as a benefit last year, because a lot of our research showed that students were really concerned about utility prices and often were looking for the security of all inclusive. Even if that meant sort of paying more for it. So you may or may not be aware, there's a number of kind of companies that do split the bills for students, and you pay a premium to do that. And I think that, so I think it's as important for landlords to be able to offer that as PBSAs now, just because, there's sort of concern from, students about that cost. And it's just, I guess, another kind of cost of living impact on them, isn't it? It's becoming increasingly expensive to be a student, I suppose.
Yeah, you guys will see the market over the last decade, the number of HMO providers that offer inclusive bills is markedly different to where we were 10 years ago. And I think, you're absolutely right about students. They're effectively trying to budget for a whole year, and there was real concern when there's stories in the media every week about the price cap going up, or do we think the price cap is going up? So it was obviously a really important consideration for them.
The last one really is for me in terms of looking ahead, sort of 5 years or so. Do you feel kind of positive in terms of what we can expect? Do you think it's going to be a positive for both PBSA and landlords? What's your kind of view on the future?
Big thing to say is we've got the universities, and we're very attractive international, and it's important that you retain that attractiveness. We've still got a growing 18-year-old population, and more people want to go to university to get qualified, to get great graduate jobs. We can't see the demand pool for accommodation not growing. I do think the big crunch is the lack of supply being delivered to the market, and the outside forces, as well as difficult planning regimes that make it so difficult to deliver beds at the moment. That is leading to this real affordability crunch, which is probably my major concern for the sector at the moment, how we overcome that, because it does seem very, very difficult to overcome at the moment.
And I think, it's a good point, David, and I think that's why I think it's important that we do retain as much HMO stock as possible as well, because I think that can provide some affordability. And one point that has come up to me recently as well is, it just might be worth dwelling on, in Europe, it's quite common for students to stay put for more than 1 year. And, whether we're going to see a student start to stay in one place for 2 or 3 years, because A, it's expensive to move, and B, there might not be anywhere to move to. So one of the reasons why I'm a bit more hopeful about maybe the impact of renters reform is, in the medium term, what we might start to see is students staying in one place So that being seen as quite an attractive market actually for landlords to get back into. So that's one of my hopes really, in terms of kind of maintaining that supply, so that we don't price students out.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And, if you look at the first year students bed ratio nationally, we could just about house every first year if every single one of them wanted a PDSA bed. So where do you go in the second and fourth year? It's a massively important part of the market, and will continue to be so.
So thank you, David. That's all of our questions, Sam. Is there anything you wanted to add before we wrap it up?
No, I was just going to touch on sort of group sizes for students, and if you got any thoughts on that. We've had a comment through from one landlord saying, I rent out on-street HMOs, and the pattern this year appears to be very different. Large groups looking for 7, 8, 9-bed properties that usually go first don't seem to have emerged yet. Anecdotally, I hear that smaller groups are looking for 3, 4-bed places. Do you have any observations or thoughts on that?
I think, from our work with universities, we do know that the 8, 10-bed HMOs and the 8, 10-bed cluster flats, they look fantastic on paper, but they perhaps don't work out fantastically in reality. So it's not a huge surprise, I don't think.
Yeah, we just historically on AFS, those are the ones that have always flown first at this time of year. And because you do get those students that have been, throughout university halls, picked up that group of friends, perhaps extended group of friends at that point, and then go for that big house. So yeah, it'd be interesting to sort of see what happens over the next couple of years, really. That we're also noticing from a search perspective as well, that students are looking more sort of individually as opposed to in groups on the website as well.
I think we have noticed that, haven't we, Simon, since post-COVID, that the larger beds, typically the bed properties, have typically tended to be less attractive since that period. So that was something we first started picking up maybe a couple of years ago, and I think we'd anticipate that from the HMO side, that might have changed by now. But I noted Steve's comment, and I think we'll do a little bit of work for him on that and see if there's anything more robust we can come up with.
I certainly think there's a big fear of missing out amongst students at the moment, but certainly from their parents as well. So we could I think we've seen people be a bit more proactive and maybe go out and going to secure that for the next year.
I think that's definitely, David, we've definitely seen that the market is getting earlier every year in terms of, that searching and starting very, very early in October. I think probably 3, 4, 5 years ago, that would have really been somewhere just like Sheffield, where Sheffield was a very early market, and now it's pretty much everywhere. And when we do our research with students, they actually, we did a lot last year, and most of them knew full well that they didn't need to start searching that early in places like Liverpool, for example, but still just did because they said that's what everybody else was doing. So it's kind of almost become like this cultural thing now.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting conundrum for universities. So you've got people searching in October, November, releases from private sector providers in November, and then in some cases you've got a 6-month lag until the university releases its own rent. So, I think it may force a number of universities to come earlier too.
Really interesting one as well, because we've noticed that some sort of PBSAs have not published their rates yet for next year. So that's really, really interesting. It's just not actively selling at this moment in time, especially when the market's been so strong in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think there was a thought that some PBSAs felt they went a little bit early last year and could have extracted higher rents. So I think the waiting is a bit of a waiting game to see whether they can maximise that those rents, which makes sense from a commercial perspective. I think that's all of our questions. So just remains to say, David, thanks so much for giving us your time. Really interesting as ever. Fantastic report. I will send a copy of the slides, the session, and a copy of the report to all of the delegates, as well as make it available on our blog. So thank you very much, David.